The November rain drummed against the metal roof of Clearwater Livestock Auction in rural Kentucky, where hope went to die and second chances were as rare as honest politicians. In the furthest corner of the yard, separated from the healthy stock, stood a sight that would break any decent person's heart. A massive Angus bull named Sun, whose 2,400-pound frame told a story of systematic neglect and broken promises. At 7:45 a.m., the early morning buyers began their assessments, but most walked right past pen 47 without a second glance. Sun stood with his head hanging low, his once magnificent black coat now dull and patchy, ribs visible through loose skin that spoke of months without proper nutrition. At only 5 years old, he should have been in his prime, commanding respect and admiration. Instead, he looked like a ghost of what he once was. Walter Goldstream had been coming to these auctions for 37 years, ever since he'd inherited Peaceful Valley Farm from his daddy. At 71, with hands weathered by decades of honest work and a heart still aching from losing his wife Helen 2 years prior, Walter moved through the pens with the careful eye of someone who understood that value often came disguised as problems other folks were too impatient to solve. "That bull, there's nothing but trouble," called out Jimmy Riverside, the yard foreman, as he noticed Walter studying Sun with unusual interest. "Owner from up in Ohio brought him in yesterday. Says he's been nothing but expense and aggravation for 2 years running. Won't breed proper, lost near 400 pounds, and gets aggressive when you try to work with him." Walter stepped closer to the pen, noting how Sun's ears perked up slightly at the sound of his gentle Kentucky drawl. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, dulled by defeat but not completely extinguished. The bull's stance, despite his obvious weakness, maintained a dignity that reminded Walter painfully of himself after Helen's funeral, wounded to the core but still standing. "What's his breeding?" Walter asked, his practiced eye taking in details that casual observers missed. The bone structure was excellent, the head noble despite the poor condition, and there was something in Sun's bearing that suggested he'd been somebody special before life knocked him down. "Registered Angus, good bloodlines according to the papers. Cost his owner near $12,000 3 years back when he was just a yearling. But he ain't been nothing but disappointment since. Vet bills alone probably run into the thousands, and he still won't perform like he's supposed to." Walter approached the fence slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Sun lifted his massive head slightly, studying this new human with the wariness of an animal that had learned to expect disappointment from every interaction. "Hey there, big fella," Walter said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that came from 4 decades of working with animals that others had written off. "You've had yourself a rough time, haven't you?" For the first time all morning, Sun took a tentative step toward the fence. Not eager, not trusting, but curious in the way of intelligent creatures testing whether this human might be different from the parade of experts and specialists who'd poked, prodded, and ultimately given up on him. The auction began promptly at noon, and Walter watched as lot after lot of healthy cattle sold to serious buyers with deep pockets and specific needs. But his attention kept returning to pen 47, where Sun waited with the quiet dignity of someone who'd accepted his fate but refused to beg for mercy he'd learned not to expect. When Sun's turn finally came, the sparse afternoon crowd had thinned to mostly bargain hunters and meat packers looking for cheap processing stock. The auctioneer's voice lacked the enthusiasm he'd shown for the morning's premium lots. "Lot 47, registered Angus bull, 5 years old. Now, folks, I'm obligated to mention this animal has had some challenges, health-wise and temperament-wise, so bid accordingly." The bidding opened at $2,000 and immediately stalled. Nobody wanted a problem bull that would likely cost more in veterinary bills than he'd ever be worth. Sun stood in the center of the ring with quiet resignation, as if he understood that this was probably his last chance at something better than the slaughterhouse. 1,500? The auctioneer tried. 1,000? A meat packer raised his hand reluctantly. 800, but only if he grades out decent. Walter's weathered hand went up. $1,000, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the half-empty arena. The few remaining bidders turned to look at the old farmer who'd just outbid a commercial operation for a bull that everyone else considered a lost cause. Walter didn't pay them any mind. He was looking straight at Sun, and for just a moment, he could swear he saw something like hope flicker in those intelligent dark eyes. sold to bidder 31 for $1,000. As Walter walked down to complete his paperwork, he felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that came with taking on a project that everyone else had abandoned. But looking at Son standing in that ring, he remembered something Helen used to say about how the best things in life often came disguised as the hardest work. "Come on, Son," Walter said quietly as he signed the purchase documents. "Let's go home and see if we can't figure out what you really need." The broken bull and the lonely widower were about to begin a journey that would prove Helen right about hard work and teach them both that sometimes the most valuable transformations happen when someone refuses to give up on what everyone else considers beyond saving. If this story of second chances already has you rooting for Walter and Son, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in the power of never giving up on those who need us most. At 2:30 p.m., the 40-minute drive from Clearwater Auction to Peaceful Valley Farm felt like the longest journey Walter had taken since bringing Helen home from the hospital for the last time. Behind him, the livestock trailer swayed gently with Son's movements, and Walter found himself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than necessary, wondering if his impulsive decision had been wisdom or foolishness. The November sky was the color of old pewter as they turned onto the gravel driveway that led to the 180-acre spread Walter had called home for most of his adult life. The white farmhouse, built by his grandfather in 1934, sat on a gentle rise overlooking rolling pastures that had seen better days since Helen's illness had consumed most of his attention and resources. Dr. Sarah Moonwater arrived within an hour of Walter's phone call, her veterinary truck loaded with equipment for what she knew would be a comprehensive evaluation. At 38, she was the third generation of her family to serve the farming community around Peaceful Valley, and she'd learned early that the animals who ended up with Walter Goldstream were usually the ones everybody else had given up on. "Walter, what have you gotten yourself into this time?" she asked with the fond exasperation of someone who'd been making this same observation for the better part of a decade. "Maybe something worthwhile," Walter replied, studying Son's posture as the bull surveyed his new surroundings from the temporary pen Walter had hastily prepared. "Maybe just an old fool's project. Time will tell." Son stood perfectly still during Dr. Moonwater's examination, as if he'd learned that resistance was futile when humans decided to work on him. But Walter noticed the bull's ears tracking every sound, his eyes alert despite his obvious exhaustion. Signs of intelligence that hadn't been dimmed by whatever mistreatment he'd endured. "The good news is there's nothing here that can't be fixed with time and proper care," Dr. Moonwater said, after nearly 2 hours of careful evaluation. "He's severely underweight, probably lost 400 pounds from his ideal body mass, suffering from chronic stress, multiple nutritional deficiencies, and his hooves haven't been properly trimmed in months. What about the temperament issues his previous owner mentioned?" Dr. Moonwater packed her stethoscope thoughtfully. "Walter, I've been working with cattle for 15 years, and I can usually tell the difference between mean animals and traumatized ones. This bull isn't aggressive, he's defensive. Big difference." That first evening, as Walter prepared Son's carefully measured feed, a special mixture Dr. Moonwater had recommended to gradually restore his digestive system, he found himself talking to the bull the way he used to talk to Helen during her final weeks, when words were more about comfort than communication. "I know you don't have much reason to trust anybody right about now," Walter said, setting the feed bucket just inside the pen. "But I've got all the time in the world, and nothing but patience for whatever you need to get better." Son approached the feed cautiously, as if expecting it to disappear or come with strings attached. When Walter made no move to hurry him or interfere, the bull began eating with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned not to take anything for granted. The next morning brought Walter's first visitor in the form of Marcus Clearwater, his closest neighbor and the man whose family had worked the adjoining land for 3 generations. At 54, Marcus had the practical wisdom that came from surviving droughts, floods, market crashes, and every other calamity that could befall a working farm. "Heard you bought that problem bull from the auction yesterday," Marcus said, settling into one of the wooden chairs on Walter's front porch with the easy familiarity of longtime friendship. "Jimmy Riverside called last night, said you paid actual money for an animal that was headed for the meat packers." Walter poured coffee from the pot that had been brewing since before dawn. "Son's got good bones under all that poor condition," Sometimes an animal just needs the right environment to show what he's really made of. Son? You've already named him? Seemed like the natural thing to do. Can't keep calling him that bull if he's going to be living here. Marcus studied his friend's face with the concern of someone who'd watched Walter struggle through 2 years of widowerhood, seeing him throw himself into increasingly challenging rescue projects as a way of avoiding the emptiness of the big house. Walter, you sure this isn't about you trying to save something because you couldn't save Helen? The question hung in the November air between them, heavy with the weight of friendship that allowed for uncomfortable truths. Walter was quiet for a long time, watching Son move slowly through the small paddock, every step deliberate and careful. Maybe it is, Walter said finally. But that doesn't make it wrong. That bull's been written off by everybody who's had him, just like plenty of folks wrote me off after Helen passed. Said I was too old to keep farming alone, too set in my ways to change. Maybe Son and I can figure out together that being written off ain't the same as being worthless. Over the following days, a routine began to emerge that would define both their recoveries. Every morning at 6 a.m., Walter would arrive at Son's paddock with carefully measured feed and fresh water, speaking in the same gentle tone about weather, farm business, and memories of Helen that he'd never shared with anyone else. Son began responding in small ways, lifting his head when he heard Walter's truck, moving toward the fence when the old farmer approached, even making soft rumbling sounds that Dr. Moonwater said were signs of contentment rather than distress. He's starting to trust you, she observed during her weekly checkup. His stress indicators are way down, and he's gained almost 50 pounds in 2 weeks. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But the real breakthrough came on a gray Thursday morning when Walter arrived to find Son standing at the fence, waiting. Not just standing, waiting with the alert posture of someone who had something to look forward to for the first time in years. Well, good morning to you too, Son, Walter said, unable to keep the smile out of his voice. Looks like you're feeling a little more like yourself today. As he prepared the feed, Walter realized that for the first time since Helen's death, he'd woken up with purpose that went beyond just getting through another day. The broken bull and the lonely widower were beginning to heal each other in ways neither had expected, proving that sometimes the best medicine for a wounded heart is taking care of someone else's. At 6:15 a.m. on a frost-covered December morning, Walter arrived at Son's paddock to find something that stopped him dead in his tracks. The bull was standing at the fence waiting for him, but more than that, Son's head was up, his ears alert, and for the first time in the 6 weeks since coming to Peaceful Valley Farm, there was something that looked almost like anticipation in his dark eyes. Well, I'll be damned, Walter murmured, setting down the feed bucket to get a better look at the transformation taking place. Son had gained nearly 150 pounds of healthy weight, his coat was starting to show its natural luster, and most remarkably, he'd begun moving with the fluid grace that spoke of strength, returning to muscles that had been weak for too long. The sound of boots on gravel announced the arrival of Marcus Clearwater, who'd taken to stopping by most mornings ostensibly to check on Walter, but really to witness the remarkable recovery happening in paddock number 3. That the same bull you brought home looking like death warmed over? Marcus asked, though they both knew the answer. Son's transformation had become the talk of the small farming community, with neighbors driving by just to see the animal that Walter Goldstream's patience and care had literally brought back from the edge. Same bull, different circumstances, Walter replied, watching his son approach the fence with confidence that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Dr. Moonwater says he's gained 180 pounds, and his blood work is better than bulls half his age. What neither man expected was Son's reaction to Marcus's presence. Instead of the wariness he'd shown toward strangers since arriving, Son actually moved closer to the fence, studying Marcus with curious intelligence rather than defensive suspicion. He's checking me out, Marcus said wonderingly. Not scared, not aggressive, just interested. Been happening more lately, Walter said, scratching behind Son's ears in a gesture that would have been impossible just a month ago. Dr. Moonwater thinks he's finally starting to feel secure enough to be social again. Says traumatized animals withdraw into themselves, but when they start healing, their natural personalities come back. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Rebecca Goldstone, a livestock photographer from Louisville whose reputation for capturing the essence of prize cattle had made her work sought after by breeders across the South. Word of Son's transformation had reached her through the network of veterinarians and farmers who followed such stories, and she'd driven 2 hours to see for herself. Mr. Goldstream, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, Rebecca said, her camera bag slung over her shoulder and her eyes already assessing Son's improved condition. Dr. Moonwater mentioned you'd achieved something remarkable with this bull, and I wondered if you'd allow me to document his recovery. Walter was initially hesitant. He'd never been comfortable with attention, and Son's healing felt too personal to turn into a public spectacle. But something in Rebecca's respectful approach and professional manner convinced him that her intentions were genuine. What exactly did you have in mind? Walter asked. Nothing intrusive, Rebecca assured him. I'm working on a series about second chances in agriculture, animals and people who've overcome significant challenges. Son's story could inspire other farmers not to give up on animals that seem hopeless. The photo session that followed revealed just how much Son had changed. Where once he'd been defensive and withdrawn, he now displayed the natural dignity and presence that spoke of his excellent breeding. Rebecca captured images of Son standing proudly in the winter sunlight, his muscles filling out his frame, his eyes bright with renewed vitality. But the most remarkable shots were of Walter and Son together. The 71-year-old farmer's weathered hands gentle on the bull's neck, both of them looking directly at the camera with the quiet confidence of beings who'd found their purpose in caring for each other. These are extraordinary, Rebecca said, reviewing the images on her camera's display. You can see the trust between you two. But more than that, you can see that this bull knows he's valued for who he is, not what he can produce. That evening, as Walter sat on his porch with the photographs Rebecca had printed for him, he called his daughter Emma for their weekly conversation. Emma lived in Nashville with her family, and since Helen's death, she'd been increasingly worried about her father's isolation on the farm. Dad, you sound different, Emma said after they'd talked for a few minutes. Happier somehow. More like yourself. Walter looked out at the paddock where Son stood contentedly in the gathering twilight and realized his daughter was right. The constant ache of loneliness that had defined his days since Helen's passing had eased to something manageable, replaced by the satisfaction that came from nurturing something back to health. I've got a project that's been keeping me busy, Walter said, and found himself telling Emma about Son's arrival and recovery in more detail than he'd shared with anyone else. Dad, that's wonderful, Emma said, and Walter could hear tears in her voice. Mom always said you had a gift for seeing potential where others saw problems. It sounds like you're using that gift again. By 8 p.m., as Walter made his final check on Son before turning in, he realized that his daughter and Helen had both been right about something important. The best way to heal a broken heart wasn't to avoid caring about anything else. It was to find something worthwhile to care about again. Son approached the fence as Walter arrived, and for the first time since Helen's death, Walter felt the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do. Sleep well, son, Walter said softly, watching as the bull settled down in the shelter Walter had built for him. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you into the big pasture with the other cattle. Might be time you remembered what it feels like to be part of a herd again. As Walter walked back to the house that no longer felt quite so empty, both man and bull were discovering that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about becoming stronger and more complete than they'd ever been before. At dawn on New Year's Day, Walter stood at his kitchen window watching Son move through the morning mist with a strength and confidence that would have been impossible to imagine just 2 months earlier. The bull had gained over 200 pounds of healthy muscle. His coat now gleamed with the deep black luster of perfect health, and most remarkably, he'd begun displaying the natural curiosity and social awareness that marked him as ready for the next phase of his recovery. The decision Walter faced wasn't easy. Son had been living alone in the rehabilitation paddock, but Dr. Moonwater had suggested it was time to introduce him to the small herd of cattle that grazed Peaceful Valley's main pasture. For a bull who'd been isolated and traumatized, rejoining a social group represented both an opportunity and a significant risk. "Morning, Walter," called Marcus Clearwater, arriving with 2 steaming cups of coffee and the newspaper that would carry Rebecca Goldstone's feature story about Son's transformation. "Today's the big day, huh?" Walter accepted the coffee gratefully, his eyes never leaving Son, as the bull investigated a new hay feeder Walter had installed the day before. Been thinking about it all night. What if the other cattle reject him? What if he's forgotten how to be social after all that isolation? The article in the Louisville Courier-Journal was everything Rebecca had promised. a thoughtful piece about second chances that presented Son's recovery as proof that patience and proper care could overcome even the most discouraging circumstances. But with the positive attention came something Walter hadn't anticipated. Phone calls from strangers wanting to buy Son. The first call came at 7:30 a.m. from a breeder in Tennessee who'd seen the article and recognized Son's bloodlines from his registration papers. The offer was substantial, $8,000 for a bull who'd cost Walter only $1,000 just 2 months earlier. "Mr. Goldstream, that bull's got the genetics to sire some exceptional calves," the breeder explained. "I can offer you a guaranteed return on your investment, plus breeding fees that could make you a good living." Walter listened politely but felt his chest tighten with something that wasn't quite anger, but was definitely protective. "Son's not for sale," he said simply. "Not for $8,000? Sir, with respect, you could buy 3 good bulls for that money." "Could buy 100 bulls and none of them would be Son," Walter replied, ending the call with a firmness that surprised even him. Dr. Moonwater arrived mid-morning for what they'd planned as Son's final health evaluation before introducing him to the herd. Her examination confirmed what Walter's eyes had been telling him. Son was in the best condition of his life, physically and mentally ready for normal social interaction with other cattle. His stress indicators are completely normal. His weight is perfect for his frame. "And look at this," she said, watching as Son approached them with relaxed confidence. 6 months ago, this bull would have been pressed against the far fence. Now he's actually seeking out interaction. The introduction process began slowly. Walter led Son to the gate that separated his paddock from the main pasture, where 5 other cattle, 3 cows and 2 young steers, grazed under the January sun. The initial meeting was cautious on both sides, with plenty of fence line sniffing and careful assessment. "They're talking to each other," Walter observed, watching the subtle communication between Son and the lead cow, a mature Angus named Belle, who'd been the herd's unofficial matriarch since arriving at Peaceful Valley 3 years earlier. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of the typical dominance displays that often accompanied new introductions, Son positioned himself respectfully at the periphery of the group, making no attempt to challenge the established social order. Belle, after several minutes of careful observation, actually approached the fence and touched noses with Son in what could only be described as acceptance. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Moonwater said quietly. "Usually bulls, especially ones with Son's size and breeding, want to establish dominance immediately. But he's showing deference, almost like he's grateful just to be included." Emma Goldstream arrived that afternoon with her husband David and their 2 teenage children, making the drive from Nashville to see the bull who'd become such an important part of her father's life. The family had been worried about Walter's isolation since Helen's death, but what they found was a man transformed by purpose and renewed by the satisfaction of successful nurturing. "Dad, he's magnificent," Emma said, watching Son interact peacefully with the other cattle through the fence. "And you look, I don't know, more like yourself than you have since Mom passed." The moment of truth came at 3 p.m., when Walter finally opened the gate and allowed Son to enter the main pasture. The bull walked through with dignity rather than eagerness, positioning himself where he could see all the other animals while maintaining respectful distance. What followed was a masterclass in bovine diplomacy. Son approached each member of the herd individually, allowing them to inspect and accept him on their terms. There were no challenges, no aggressive displays, just the patient work of building relationships with animals who would become his new family. "Grandpa," said Emma's daughter Sarah, a 16-year-old who'd inherited her family's love of animals, "it's like he knows how lucky he is to be here." By evening, Son had been fully accepted by the herd, grazing contentedly alongside cattle who just that morning had been strangers. Walter stood at the fence watching his animals in the fading light, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Helen's illness began, the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made a real difference in the world. The phone rang again that evening with another offer to buy Son, this one for $12,000 from a breeder who'd heard about the bull's remarkable recovery and wanted him for a prestigious breeding program. "Not interested," Walter said without hesitation. "Sir, that's a significant profit on a bull you bought for practically nothing." Walter looked out at the pasture where Son stood peacefully with his new family and realized that some things in life were worth more than money could measure. "Son's not an investment," he said quietly. "He's home." As Walter ended the call, he understood that Son's transformation had been matched by his own. The lonely widower who'd bought a broken bull on impulse had rediscovered that the most valuable things in life often came disguised as responsibilities rather than opportunities. Both man and bull had found something worth more than profit. They'd found purpose, belonging, and the profound satisfaction that comes from refusing to give up on something that everyone else considers beyond saving. At 6:30 a.m. on a warm May morning, Walter Goldstream walked through the dew-covered pasture of Peaceful Valley Farm with a spring in his step that hadn't been there since before Helen's illness. 6 months had passed since Son's integration with the herd, and what had begun as one man's attempt to save a broken bull had evolved into something far more significant than either could have imagined. Son now stood at the center of the pasture like a gentle giant, his magnificent frame fully restored to its natural glory. At 2,600 pounds of pure muscle and dignity, he moved through the herd with the quiet authority of a natural leader who'd earned his position through patience rather than aggression. The other cattle followed him not out of fear, but out of respect for his calm wisdom and protective instincts. "Morning, Son," Walter called out, and the bull's massive head turned toward him with the immediate recognition that spoke of a bond deeper than mere familiarity. Son approached the fence with the confident gait of an animal who knew he was valued, loved, and permanently home. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by the agricultural community. Rebecca Goldstone's follow-up articles had been picked up by national farming magazines, and Peaceful Valley Farm had become an unlikely destination for veterinarians, animal behaviorists, and farmers who wanted to witness firsthand what patient, respectful care could accomplish. Dr. Moonwater arrived for her monthly checkup with news that would have surprised Walter 6 months earlier, but now seemed like the natural result of everything they'd achieved together. "Walter, I've been asked to present Son's case at the American Veterinary Medical Association conference next month," she said, reviewing her examination notes. "His recovery isn't just remarkable, it's revolutionary. We documented a complete physical and psychological transformation that challenges everything the industry thinks it knows about problem animals." "What exactly would you tell them?" Walter asked, watching Son demonstrate his remarkable gentleness by allowing Emma's youngest grandchild, 4-year-old Michael, to pet his enormous nose through the fence. "That trauma masquerading as aggression is more common than anyone wants to admit," Dr. Moonwater replied. "And that patient, consistent care can heal wounds we didn't even know existed." Son's story could change how the entire industry approaches animal rehabilitation. The phone calls from prospective buyers had never stopped, with offers now reaching $25,000 from breeders who recognized Son's exceptional genetics and proven fertility. Walter had turned them all down without hesitation, but the attention had brought something unexpected. Requests from farmers across the country who wanted to send their own problem animals to Peaceful Valley for rehabilitation. "I can't take on every broken animal in America," Walter told Marcus during one of their morning coffee sessions. "But maybe I can show folks that giving up shouldn't be the first option when things get difficult." The solution came from an unexpected source. Emma, who'd been watching her father's transformation with the same amazement as everyone else, approached him with a proposition that would honor both Helen's memory and Son's legacy. "Dad, what if we formalized what you're already doing?" she suggested during a family dinner that had become a monthly tradition since Son's arrival. The Helen Goldstream Center for Animal Rehabilitation, a nonprofit that could help train other farmers in your methods. Walter was initially resistant to the idea of institutionalizing what felt deeply personal, but as he watched Son interact with a traumatized young heifer that Marcus had brought over for evaluation, he realized that keeping their success to themselves would be selfish. The center's first official student arrived in June. A mare named Luna, who'd been written off as dangerous after a trailer accident, left her terrified of human contact. Walter applied the same patient, consistent approach he'd used with Son, and within 3 months, Luna was accepting riders again. "It's not magic," Walter explained to a group of veterinary students who'd come to observe his methods. "It's just refusing to give up on something that deserves a chance to heal. These animals aren't broken, they're hurt. And hurt can be healed if you're willing to do the work." Rebecca Goldstone's book about Son's transformation, The Bull Nobody Wanted, became a bestseller in agricultural circles and beyond, inspiring countless stories of successful animal rehabilitation across the country. But for Walter, the real measure of success wasn't found in book sales or magazine articles. It was in the daily routines that had given both his and Son's lives meaning and purpose. By sunset on this perfect May evening, as Walter made his final check on the animals, he found Son exactly where he expected, standing protectively near the newest arrival to Peaceful Valley, a young bull named Hope, who'd arrived that morning bearing the same defeated expression Son had worn just 10 months earlier. "Looks like you're going to teach another one what it means to belong somewhere," Walter said, scratching behind Son's ears in the gesture that had become their daily greeting. Son's response was the deep, contented rumble that Walter had learned meant satisfaction, security, and home. As the old farmer watched, Son moved closer to the frightened newcomer, positioning himself where Hope could see that safety was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that sometimes the most broken souls were exactly the ones worth saving. Emma arrived just as Walter was heading back to the house, her weekly visit now as much about checking on the center's operations as spending time with her father. "Dad, there's something I want to tell you," she said, walking beside him through the gathering twilight. "These past months, watching you with Son and all the other animals, it's like getting my father back. Mom would be so proud of what you've built here." Walter stopped walking and looked back at the pasture where Son stood guard over Hope, teaching by example that healing was possible when someone cared enough to be patient. The lonely widower who'd bought a broken bull on impulse had discovered that the best way to honor Helen's memory wasn't to preserve her absence, but to continue the work of nurturing and healing that had defined their life together. "Helen always said that love multiplies when you give it away," Walter said quietly. "Guess Son and I just proved her right." As father and daughter walked toward the house where warm light spilled from windows that no longer felt empty, Walter realized that Son's transformation had been complete. Not just from broken to whole, but from rescued to rescuer, from outcast to leader, from problem to solution. The bull nobody wanted had become the teacher everyone needed, proving that second chances weren't just about fixing what was broken, but about discovering strengths that had been hidden beneath the pain. In saving Son, Walter had saved himself, and together they'd created a legacy that would continue helping both animals and humans long after their own stories were finished. The transformation was complete, but the work of healing would go on forever, exactly as it should be. In this story of second chances and the power of patient love, a broken bull and a lonely farmer discover that the most profound transformations happen not when we fix others, but when we allow ourselves to be healed by the act of caring without reservation or expectation of return. Rejected Bull was broken and weak until an old farmer took him in and his life changed forever.